The first glimmers of dawn rarely brought rest, but rather a cold, quiet urgency to the small, smoky cottage. For a man of the land, every day began long before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. His bed was a simple straw mattress, often shared with his wife, and sometimes their youngest child, nestled against them for warmth. The air within their single-room dwelling was thick with the scent of wood smoke from the central hearth, a constant companion against the damp chill that seeped through the wattle and daub walls. He would stir, usually before his wife, and push himself up with a grunt. The floor beneath his bare feet was packed earth, cold and unforgiving. He moved quietly, careful not to wake the sleeping children, lest their cries add another layer of demand to an already demanding day. A few embers might still glow in the hearth, relics of last night's fire, a small mercy that saved the laborious task of striking new sparks. He would carefully add a few small pieces of kindling, blowing gently until a flame took hold, its weak light struggling against the lingering darkness. His wife would soon join him, moving with the practiced efficiency of a woman whose life was a ceaseless cycle of labor. While he tended to the fire, she might fetch water from the village well, a heavy wooden bucket slashing as she carried it back. This water would be used for a rudimentary wash, a sparse splash on faces and hands, and then for the morning pottage, a thin gruel of oats or barley, cooked slowly over the fire. It was a meager meal, but it filled the belly, providing the necessary warmth and energy for the hours of back-breaking work ahead. Bread, if they had any left from the previous day's baking, would be a welcome addition, though often it was a luxury reserved for busier times or slightly better seasons. With the first light of the true dawn, he would be out of the cottage. His tools, crude but essential, lay waiting. A heavy wooden ard, a basic trowel without a moldboard, a hoe, a sickle. His clothes were simple: a tunic of coarse wool or linen tied at the waist with a rope, and worn leather boots patched countless times. In colder weather, a cloak would offer some protection against the biting winds. He possessed little, but what he had was vital to his survival. His first destination was often the communal fields, the strips of land that comprised the village's open field system. This land, though worked by the peasants, ultimately belonged to the lord of the manor. He held several strips scattered across the manor's 3 fields, an ancient system designed to ensure fairness in land quality and to facilitate communal farming practices. Each season brought its own relentless demands. In spring, the heavy work of plowing dominated. He would harness his ox, a sturdy, slow beast that was his most valuable possession, often shared with a neighbor if he didn't own one outright. Together, they would turn the earth, the ard biting into the soil, leaving shallow furrows. It was slow, arduous work, the ground often stubborn and cloddy. He would walk behind the ard, guiding it, his muscles straining with every step. Following the plow, sowing began. He would scatter the seeds by hand, a practiced gesture, praying silently for good weather and a bountiful harvest. His livelihood, his family's survival, depended entirely on the yield of these precious grains. Summer brought the relentless task of weeding, battling against the tenacious plants that competed with his precious crops. It was a never-ending chore, bending under the hot sun, his back aching, hands calloused and dirt-stained. He might also be involved in haymaking, cutting the grasses in the meadow for winter fodder for the animals. The smell of freshly cut hay would fill the air, a fleeting sweetness amidst the general dust and sweat. But the most crucial time was late summer and early autumn, harvest. This was a period of frantic communal effort. Every available hand, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, would be out in the fields. With his sickle, he would swing rhythmically, cutting swaths of ripe grain. The sun beat down, sweat streamed, and dust clung to everything, but the work was urgent. The grain had to be gathered before the weather turned, before storms could flatten the precious stalks. Stacks of sheaves would rise across the fields, symbols of their labor and their hope. After the cutting, the grain would be threshed, separating the valuable kernels from the useless chaff, often by beating it with flails on a threshing floor. Then it would be winnowed, using the wind to blow away the lighter chaff. The day in the fields was punctuated by simple meals. At midday, his wife or one of the older children might bring out a piece of dark bread and some cheese, or perhaps a small portion of dried meat or fish, along with water or weak ale. There was no real break, merely a pause to refuel before returning to the unending demands of the land. Beyond the cultivation of his own strips, he was also obligated to work the Lord's domain, the land directly controlled by the manor lord. These boon work days were part of the rent he paid for his tenancy, a labor service that could take him away from his own fields at critical times. He might be required to plow the Lord's land, spread manure, repair fences, or transport goods. Resentment often simmered beneath the surface, but defiance was unthinkable. The Lord held the power of justice, the power of the land, and ultimately the power over his very existence. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the fields, he would finally gather his tools and begin the slow, weary walk back to his cottage. His body ached, his muscles screamed from the day's exertion. But a different kind of exhaustion settled in, the quiet satisfaction of work done and the hope for a modest return. Back in the village, the air would be filled with the sounds of evening, the lowing of cattle, the chatter of neighbors, the faint smell of cooking fires from other homes. Inside his own dwelling, his wife would have been busy all day as well, no less tirelessly than he. She would have tended their small garden plot next to the cottage, growing vegetables like cabbages, onions, and beans, and herbs for flavor and medicine. She would have spun wool into yarn, mended clothes, prepared the meals, cared for the younger children, perhaps even tended a few chickens or a pig. Her work was the bedrock of the household, unseen but utterly essential. Their evening meal would be similar to the morning pottage, perhaps thicker, with whatever vegetables were available from the garden. Meat was a rarity, often reserved for feast days or after a successful hunt on common lands, though hunting rights were often strictly controlled by the Lord. They would eat by the light of the hearth, its flames casting dancing shadows on the mud walls. This was a time for the family to gather, for quiet conversation, for his wife to tell him about the day's happenings in the village, or for the children to recount their small adventures. As darkness fully enveloped the village, he would prepare for sleep. He might check on his animals, share a final word with a neighbor, or simply sit by the dying embers of the fire, contemplating the endless cycle of the seasons. There was no artificial light beyond their flickering fire, and no distractions save for the quiet sounds of the village settling down for the night. Sleep came easily, a heavy, dreamless slumber, born of sheer physical exhaustion. Life was a relentless rhythm, dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the strictures of the manor. Sunday was a day of rest from the hardest field labor, dedicated to attending Mass at the village church, a central pillar of their lives. The priest, though sometimes a distant figure, was the spiritual guide, offering solace and explaining the divine will. The church was also a social hub, a place for news and community gathering. Occasional feast days, tied to the Christian calendar or agricultural milestones, offered brief respites, a rare opportunity for better food, perhaps some ale, and simple entertainment, like dancing or storytelling. But even with these small comforts, life for the man and his family was precarious. Famine was a constant threat, lurking just beyond a bad harvest. Disease, unseen and little understood, could sweep through the village, claiming young and old alike. Taxes and renders paid to the Lord in coin, kind, like grain, eggs, or chickens, or labor, were an ever-present burden. Yet within this demanding existence, there was resilience. The community was strong, bound by shared hardship and mutual aid. Neighbors helped neighbors, families supported each other, and the cycle of life continued, generation after generation, bound to the land.
The dawn for a medieval lord or lady arrived with a different cadence than for those toiling in the fields below. There was no immediate struggle against the damp chill, but rather a slow stirring within layers of fine linen and wool on a bed often adorned with curtains for privacy and warmth. The air might carry the faint scent of rushes strewn across the floor, or the lingering fragrance of beeswax from polished wood. A servant, usually a personal attendant, would gently rouse the occupant, bringing warmed water for a rudimentary wash and perhaps a fresh tunic. For the Lord, his day began with duties that weighed heavily on his shoulders: the management of his lands, the dispensing of justice, and the constant readiness for conflict. He would dress in garments of richer fabric, wool dyed with vibrant colors, or perhaps silk for special occasions, fastened with buckles and pins. His boots would be of finer leather, more for status than for the practicalities of fieldwork. After a brief private prayer, perhaps in a small chapel within his chambers, he might join his household for a light breakfast of bread, ale, and perhaps some roasted meat or cheese. His mornings were typically consumed by administration. Seated at a sturdy table, often in the great hall or a private solar, he would meet with his steward, the man responsible for overseeing the manor's economic affairs. The steward would report on harvests, rents collected, stock levels, and any disputes among the peasants. Decisions regarding land allocation, crop rotation, and the repair of vital infrastructure like mills or bridges would be made. He would listen patiently, offering pronouncements and solutions, his authority absolute within his domain. Justice was another critical responsibility. He often presided over the manor court, hearing petitions, settling arguments, and imposing fines or punishments for minor infractions. His word was law, and his decisions shaped the daily lives of hundreds. For the lady, her mornings were equally packed, though her responsibilities lay predominantly within the walls of the castle or manor house. Her domain was the intricate world of the household. She would oversee the preparation of meals, consulting with the cook on provisions and menus, especially if guests were expected. Her knowledge of medicinal herbs and remedies was vital, as she was often the primary healer for her family and even for some of the servants. She would manage the household staff, the scullery maids, laundresses, seamstresses, and chamberlains, ensuring the smooth running of a complex domestic machine. This involved everything from ordering supplies, overseeing the weaving and mending of textiles, to educating her own children and any young noblewomen fostered in her household. Her presence brought order and often a quiet strength to the sprawling medieval home.
Midday brought the main meal, a significant event in the noble household. Depending on the manor's wealth and the occasion, it could range from a simple, hearty repast to a lavish feast. The great hall would fill with the sounds of conversation, the clatter of trenchers, stale bread slices used as plates, and the distant barking of hounds beneath the tables. A lord and lady would sit at the high table, elevated on a dais, symbolizing their status. Servants would bring in platters of roasted meats, venison, boar, poultry, along with various stews, fresh bread, and sometimes exotic spices if trade allowed. Wine and ale flowed freely. Entertainment, such as a minstrel playing a lute or a storyteller recounting tales of chivalry, often accompanied the meal, breaking the monotony and cementing social bonds. After the meal, the afternoon presented opportunities for both work and leisure. The lord might engage in military exercises, practicing with sword and shield in the castle yard, or overseeing the training of his retinue. Archery was a common skill, as was horsemanship. If the weather was fair, hunting was a popular pastime, a blend of sport, social ritual, and a way to procure fresh meat. Mounted on a fine horse, accompanied by hounds and falconers, he would ride through his lands, a display of wealth and power. Negotiations with visiting dignitaries, discussions of political alliances, or detailed planning for upcoming campaigns might also fill his hours. The lady, meanwhile, might oversee the needlework of her attendants, creating tapestries or garments. She might visit the household workshops, ensuring the smooth operation of the laundry or the bakery. Correspondence with other noblewomen, perhaps arranging marriages or discussing family matters, also formed part of her day. In a well-managed household, her hand touched every aspect of daily life, from the cleanliness of the linens to the propriety of the younger members of the household. She might also spend time in her garden, cultivating herbs and flowers, or reading from illuminated manuscripts if she possessed literacy, a skill not always common even among the nobility. As evening approached, the household would gather again for a lighter supper. This might be a more intimate affair, especially if there were no high-ranking guests. After the meal, stories might be told by the fire, or a traveling scholar or cleric might read aloud from religious texts or chronicles. Dice and board games were common diversions. Eventually, the household would disperse, retreating to their chambers, often with a final blessing from the household chaplain.
Life in the castle or manor house was far from one of pure indulgence. While the lord and lady enjoyed comforts unknown to their peasants, their positions carried immense responsibilities and pressures. The lord bore the burden of defending his lands and people, often requiring him to lead his men into battle, or at the very least, finance and equip them. Political alliances were fluid, and a lord constantly navigated a complex web of loyalty and treachery, both from his own vassals and from neighboring lords or his own liege. His financial management had to be astute. A manor's economy was often a delicate balance, vulnerable to bad harvests, disease, or the costs of warfare. The lady, too, might find herself thrust into leadership. When her lord was away on campaign, she was often left in charge of the entire estate, responsible for its defense, its finances, and the welfare of its people. She might even oversee the repair of fortifications or the mustering of local levies. Her resilience and capability could mean the difference between the survival and ruin of her family's patrimony. She was the anchor of the household, the guardian of its continuity, and often a quiet force in local politics. The castle or manor itself was a living entity, filled with the constant hum of activity. Servants moved through its passages, pages carrying messages, squires attending to knights, cooks and their assistants bustling in the kitchens, guards patrolling the walls. The very stones of the keep or hall seemed to echo with the lives lived within its confines, a monument to the lord's authority and a hub of power in a decentralized world. It was a place of safety, but also a cage of responsibility, where the comfort of high status was inextricably bound to the ceaseless demands of leadership. Hummed with human activity from before dawn until well after dusk. For a craftsman, say a skilled baker, or a bustling merchant, his life revolved around the rhythm of trade, the demands of his guild, and the close-packed community of the urban space.
A baker's day often began in the pre-dawn darkness, long before the sun had even thought of gracing the narrow, winding streets. His home, a timber-framed building, was often attached directly to his workshop and shopfront, a practical blend of living and livelihood. He would descend from his upper sleeping chamber into the warmth of the bakery, where the large brick oven was already being stoked by an apprentice or a younger family member. The scent of wood smoke and nascent dough would fill the air. His hands, perpetually dusted with flour, would move with practiced efficiency, kneading vast quantities of dough in wooden troughs. Bread was the staff of life for everyone, from the poorest peasant to the wealthiest noble, and the baker's skill ensured his livelihood. The clanking and hammering of a blacksmith would begin shortly after, the ringing of his hammer on the anvil a percussive start to the working day. He would be shaping iron into tools, hinges, weapons, or armor, the glow of his forge a beacon in the early morning gloom. For a weaver, the rhythmic clack of his loom would start up, producing lengths of cloth that would soon be dyed and tailored into garments. Each craftsman was a specialist, deeply embedded in the town's economic fabric. As the sun rose higher, the town truly came alive. The shop fronts would open, revealing wares ranging from finely crafted leather goods to shimmering links of silk.
Merchants, whose lives often involved more travel and risk, would be in their counting houses, reviewing ledgers, negotiating prices, or preparing goods for shipment. A merchant's home might be grander, reflecting his accumulated wealth, often with a large warehouse below and living quarters above. His day was less about physical craft and more about calculation, negotiation, and risk assessment. He dealt in commodities, from wool and grain to exotic spices and precious metals, connecting the town to wider networks of trade. The medieval town was a place of close quarters. Houses huddled together, often with upper stories overhanging the street, creating a dim tunneled effect below. Animals shared the space, chickens scratching in the alleyways, pigs foraging for scraps, and the ever-present horses and carts. Sanitation was a perpetual challenge. Refuse was
often thrown into the streets or open drains, contributing to a pervasive, unpleasant odor, especially in warmer months. Yet, despite the grime, there was a palpable energy, a sense of opportunity and dynamism that drew people from the static life of the manor. Central to a craftsman's life was his guild. A powerful institution, the guild governed nearly every aspect of his profession. He would likely have started as an apprentice in his youth, living and working in his master's home, learning the trade for 7 or more years. After becoming a journeyman, he would travel and work for different masters, honing his skills until finally he could present a masterpiece to the guild and be admitted as a master craftsman himself. The guild set standards for quality, regulated prices, controlled who could practice the trade, and provided a social safety net, offering support to members in times of sickness or old age. It was a brotherhood, a network of mutual support and fierce protection of their craft's integrity. Market day was the town's weekly pulsating heart. Peasants from the surrounding countryside would flood into the town, bringing their surplus produce, eggs, butter, cheese, vegetables, to sell or barter. Merchants would display their goods in stalls, shouting out prices, while craftsmen showcased their finished products. The marketplace was a cacophony of voices, a kaleidoscope of colors, and a vital nexus for the town's economy. It was also a prime opportunity for news and gossip to spread, connecting the urban populace to the wider world. Beyond work, civic duties played a role in the townsman's life. Many towns had charters granting them varying degrees of self-governance, often in exchange for taxes paid to the king or a powerful lord. A prosperous merchant or master craftsman might serve on the town council, helping to manage its finances, defense, and public order. Walls were often built for protection, and citizens might be called upon to help maintain them or serve in the town militia. The bell of the town hall or the church often dictated the rhythm of civic life, signaling market times, curfews, or emergencies. Evenings in town offered more social interaction than the solitary life of a peasant. Taverns and alehouses buzzed with conversation, news, and the occasional song or dice game. For a craftsman, his shop might close by sunset, but his home would remain active. His family, his wife, children, and perhaps apprentices and journeymen would gather for the evening meal, often more varied than a peasant's, with perhaps salted fish, cured meats, and a wider range of vegetables. The light of candles or oil lamps would illuminate the interior, a luxury unknown in the countryside. The wife of a craftsman or merchant was often an active partner in the family business. She might manage the shop front, handle sales, keep accounts, or even be skilled in a related craft herself. She ran the household, cared for the children, and maintained social connections vital to their standing. Her contribution was indispensable, often allowing her husband to focus on the production or broader trade. Despite the relative prosperity compared to peasant life, town life had its own set of challenges. Fires were a constant danger in the closely packed wooden buildings, capable of destroying entire districts in a single night. Disease, spread rapidly by poor sanitation and dense populations, was a persistent threat, with outbreaks of plague or other ailments able to decimate a town's population. Crime, though perhaps less violent than in the wilder countryside, existed in the form of theft and petty disputes, requiring the vigilance of town watchmen and the fairness of town courts. Yet, the town offered opportunity. It was a place where skill, initiative, and daring could lead to prosperity and social mobility, a stark contrast to the rigid hierarchy of the feudal manor. The town was a hub of innovation, wealth creation, and cultural exchange, a vibrant crucible where the seeds of a new world, less bound by the land, were slowly beginning to sprout. Beyond the bustling towns and the sprawling manors, another world existed, guided by a rhythm entirely distinct from the cycles of planting or the demands of commerce. This was the cloistered life, found within the silent, hallowed walls of a monastery or convent. For those who chose this path, a monk or a nun, it was a life dedicated entirely to God, often from a young age, a deliberate turning away from the secular world in pursuit of spiritual devotion and scholarly pursuit. His day as a monk began in the deepest hours before dawn, often at matins, the first of the 8 daily prayer services known as the Divine Office. Awakened by the bell, he would rise from his simple cell, a small room with a bed, a desk, and perhaps a crucifix. His habit, a simple robe of rough wool, was his only garment, symbolizing his detachment from worldly vanity. He would walk through the dim cloisters, the cool stone echoing his quiet footsteps, towards the abbey church. There, in the flickering light of candles, he and his brethren would chant psalms and prayers, their voices rising in unison, a sacred sound filling the vast silent space. After matins, he might spend time in private prayer or silent contemplation before the next service, lauds, which coincided with the first light of day. This disciplined adherence to prayer was the bedrock of monastic life, puncturing every few hours of the day and night. His life was not his own. It belonged to God and to the community, governed by the strict rules of his order, most commonly the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized prayer, work, and study. Her day as a nun in a convent mirrored this devout routine. She too would rise in the dark, her habit a simple yet dignified garment, often with a veil signifying her consecration. Her cell, though sparse, was a sanctuary for quiet devotion. She would join her sisters in the conventual church, their voices joining in the ancient chants of the office, a powerful expression of communal faith. For many women, particularly those of noble birth who might not marry, the convent offered an alternative to the rigid social structures outside, providing an opportunity for education, leadership, and a life of profound spiritual purpose. The hours between prayer services were dedicated to various forms of work and study. For a monk, this might mean toiling in the monastery's fields, cultivating vegetables, tending vineyards, or managing livestock, ensuring the community's self-sufficiency. Others might work in the scriptorium, the monastery's writing room. Here, in quiet dedication, he would painstakingly copy religious texts, classical manuscripts, or chronicles, preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost. His hand would move slowly across the parchment, forming elegant letters, often adding intricate illuminations to beautify the sacred words. This work was seen as a form of prayer, a spiritual exercise that contributed to the glory of God and the education of others. Some monks specialized in crafts, brewing ale, baking bread, carpentry, or tending to the sick in the infirmary. The monastery was a self-contained world, a small village itself, capable of providing for nearly all its needs. Hospitality was also a core duty, and the monastery often served as a vital stopping point for travelers, pilgrims, and merchants, offering safe lodging and a simple meal. He might be assigned to assist in welcoming these guests, a brief connection to the world he had forsaken. For a nun, her work might involve spinning and weaving cloth, preparing vestments for the church, tending to the convent garden, or caring for orphans and the sick within the community. Many convents were also centers of learning for young girls, particularly those from noble families, and a nun might spend her hours instructing them in reading, writing, and religious doctrine. Her life, though confined, was rich with purpose and intellectual engagement. Meals in the refectory were simple and communal, eaten in silence while one of the brethren or sisters read aloud from a religious text. The diet was often vegetarian, adhering to strict fasts and abstinence, particularly during Lent. It was a time for physical nourishment, but also for spiritual contemplation, an extension of their continuous devotion. The monastic day moved from 1 hour to the next: prime at sunrise, terce mid-morning, sext at midday, none mid-afternoon, vespers in the evening, and finally compline before retiring. Each service was a moment of reflection, a call to refocus on the divine purpose of their existence. The bells of the monastery or convent dictated this unwavering rhythm, a constant reminder of their vows. Despite their separation from the secular world, monasteries and convents were deeply intertwined with medieval society. They were significant landowners, generating wealth through agriculture and crafts. They served as centers of learning and scholarship, preserving ancient texts and fostering intellectual life during a period when literacy was rare outside the clergy. They acted as hospitals and places of charity, providing care for the poor and the sick. They also served as safe havens, sometimes even fortified against external threats. The challenges of the cloistered life were profound. It required immense self-discipline, a constant battle against worldly temptations and the monotony of routine. Life could be harsh, with cold cells, sparse food, and rigorous fasting. Yet for many, the solace of communal prayer, the intellectual stimulation of study, and the deep sense of spiritual fulfillment offered a profound sense of purpose and peace. He or she found comfort in the unwavering rhythm of the divine office, the shared commitment of their brethren or sisters, and the knowledge that their lives were dedicated to a higher calling, serving God and humanity in a unique and powerful way.
His life began not with the plow or the loom, nor within the quiet walls of a cloister, but with the clatter of steel and the thud of hooves. For a young noble, destined for the martial life, his journey towards knighthood began almost as soon as he could walk. It was a rigorous path, steeped in tradition, discipline, and the expectation of unwavering loyalty. His early years were spent in his father's household, or more often, fostered in the castle of a higher-ranking lord. This early fostering was crucial, designed to teach him the etiquette and customs of courtly life, while also ensuring his loyalty was tied not just to his birth family, but to his liege lord. As a mere child, a page, he would perform light duties, running messages, serving at table, fetching and carrying for the ladies and knights of the household. But even then, his education was subtly martial. He learned to ride, to handle small weapons, and to observe the knights, absorbing their code of conduct. He would hear tales of chivalry and heroic deeds, shaping his understanding of what it meant to be a man of arms.
As he grew older, typically around the age of 14, his training intensified. He would become a squire, directly serving a knight. His duties became more demanding and intimately tied to the knight's daily life. He would clean the knight's armor, polish his weapons, and care for his warhorse, a valuable and powerful beast. He would help his knight don the heavy, intricate armor before battle or tournament, a process that required skill and strength. On campaign, he would carry his knight's shield and lance, tending to his needs in the field, and even assisting with wounds. But the core of his life as a squire was martial training. Every day brought rigorous exercises. He would spend hours practicing with the sword, learning to deliver powerful, precise blows and to defend against them. He would wield a heavy, blunted sword, often against a quintain, a rotating dummy that spun if struck improperly, providing instant feedback. He learned to fight on foot and, crucially, from horseback. Jousting, initially with blunted lances, became a central skill, requiring immense balance, strength, and courage to control a charging horse while aiming a lance at a moving target. Archery, wrestling, and unarmed combat were also part of his regimen, building his strength and agility. Physical pain was an accepted part of the learning process, Bruises, cuts, and broken bones were not uncommon. Endurance was key, for battle demanded tireless effort. Beyond the physical, his education also encompassed the chivalric code. He learned about loyalty to his lord, courage in the face of danger, generosity, and courtesy towards ladies. Though often idealized in song and story, these tenets formed the moral framework of his world, guiding his actions in peace and war. He might learn to read and write, though martial skills often took precedence over scholarly pursuits. He also learned the art of falconry and hunting, crucial skills for a noble, providing food and sport. His first experience of true battle might come while still a squire, accompanying his knight to war. The chaos, fear, and brutality of combat would be a stark contrast to the structured training yard. He would witness firsthand the consequences of failure and the grim reality of life and death on the battlefield. Finally, usually in his late teens or early 20s, if he had proved his worth, endured his training, and possessed the means, he would be ready for the ultimate honor, knighthood. The ceremony was deeply symbolic. He would typically spend a night in vigil, praying in a church, preparing himself spiritually. The next morning, before his lord, often surrounded by fellow knights and noblewomen, he would kneel. His lord would tap him lightly on the shoulder with a sword, the accolade, while uttering the words, "Be a knight." He might also be girded with the sword and given his spurs, symbols of his new status. Now, as a knight, his life gained new purpose and responsibility. He was a sworn warrior, bound by fealty to his lord. He was expected to provide military service, leading his own small retinue if he held lands, or serving directly in his lord's army. His skills in warfare, honed over years, were now put to their true test. He might participate in tournaments, which were often elaborate, dangerous spectacles, a blend of sport and military training, offering opportunities for glory, ransom, and prize money. His armor, a heavy, intricate assembly of steel plates, became his second skin in battle, designed to protect him from the blows of sword and axe and the penetration of arrows. His primary weapons were the lance, used in a charge, and the sword for close quarters combat. He was a professional warrior, part of an elite fighting force that dominated the medieval battlefield. Yet, a knight's life was not solely about combat. He was also a landowner, expected to manage his estates, oversee his tenants, and uphold the Lord's law. He might serve as a local judge or administrator, extending the Lord's authority into the countryside. He was a pillar of the feudal system, owing loyalty and service to his liege, and in turn receiving land and protection. Challenges were ever present. The constant threat of injury or death in battle, the financial strain of maintaining armor, horses, and a retinue, and the complex political maneuvering of the noble class. He might be called upon to enforce his lord's will, even if it meant harsh actions against peasants or rival knights. Yet, through it all, he lived by a code, however imperfectly applied, that emphasized courage, honor, and service, embodying the martial ideal of the medieval age. Her life in the medieval world was, by and large, defined by her gender. Yet, within that framework existed a myriad of experiences, challenges, and quiet triumphs. While her husband, brother, or father might be seen as the head of the household or the face of public life, her efforts were the invisible, indispensable bedrock upon which the entire social structure rested. Whether noble, peasant, or townswoman, her existence was characterized by a distinct set of duties, expectations, and limitations. From birth, her path was often predetermined, largely by her social standing. A peasant girl, barely out of infancy, would begin to learn the myriad domestic skills from her mother and older sisters. A noble daughter, while perhaps offered more education in literacy or courtly arts, would still be groomed for her ultimate role, marriage, a political and economic alliance for her family. Her legal status was typically subordinate to that of her father or husband. Upon marriage, her property often became her husband's, and her voice in legal matters was generally heard through his. Yet, customs varied, and in some regions or under specific circumstances, a woman could own property, engage in business, or exercise more independence. Marriage was, for most women, an inevitable and often early transition. For the peasant woman, it was a union that brought together two families, strengthening their labor force and securing land. For the noble woman, it was a strategic arrangement, sometimes decided when she was still a child, with little input from her. The ceremony, often religious, symbolized the binding of two souls and two families. Once married, her primary role was often seen as that of a wife and mother, bearing and raising children being paramount, especially sons, to ensure the continuation of the family line and inheritance. Childbirth was a perilous event for any medieval woman, regardless of status. Without modern medical knowledge, complications were common, and both mother and child faced significant risks of death. Superstition and folk remedies often accompanied prayers as she faced this ordeal with courage. If she survived, the responsibilities of motherhood began immediately. She would nurse her infants and, as they grew, teach her daughters the skills they would need, while sons would often be handed over to their fathers or, if noble, sent away to be pages. Within the peasant household, her domain was absolute, though unseen by outsiders. She was the manager of the domestic economy. While her husband labored in the fields, she was responsible for processing the raw materials of their meager existence. She would grind grain into flour using a hand quern or take it to the Lord's mill, bake bread in the communal oven, and prepare the family's daily meals over the hearth. She spun wool into yarn and wove it into cloth, mending garments that were worn until disintegrated. She tended a small garden plot by the cottage, cultivating vegetables and herbs for both food and rudimentary medicine. She might also oversee a few chickens or a pig, turning their products into vital supplements for the family diet or small sums of cash. Her work was ceaseless, physically demanding, and utterly vital to the family's survival. Without her tireless efforts, the household would collapse. In the noble household, a lady's responsibilities were grander in scale but equally demanding. She managed a vast array of servants, from the scullery maids to the chamberlains, ensuring the smooth operation of a complex, often sprawling domestic machine. She oversaw the provisioning of the castle, from ordering foodstuffs to ensuring the proper storage of supplies. She was often the primary healer for her family and the household, possessing knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medical procedures. She might manage the estate's finances in her lord's absence, or even lead the defense of the castle during siege. She educated her own children and any young noble women fostered in her household, teaching them courtly graces, basic literacy, and the intricacies of household management. Her authority within the household was considerable, reflecting the amassed trust placed in her by her husband or father. For the townswoman, life offered slightly more varied opportunities, though still within defined boundaries. The wife of a craftswoman often worked alongside her husband, managing the shopfront, handling sales, and keeping accounts. She might even be skilled in her husband's trade, or a related one, and sometimes continue the business after his death. Many women were involved in brewing ale, a common and profitable domestic industry, baking, spinning, weaving, or selling goods in the market. There were also women in service, working as laundresses, maids, or nurses in wealthier households. While guilds often restricted female membership, some she-merchants operated independently, engaging in small-scale trade. Town life, with its greater economic dynamism, offered a degree of autonomy and commercial engagement not typically found in the countryside. Regardless of her station, she faced inherent challenges. Childbearing was a constant threat. Legal recourse for grievances was often limited. Societal expectations demanded modesty, obedience, and virtue, especially for women of higher status, whose reputation was tied to the family's honor. Violence, from domestic abuse to the ravages of war, was an ever-present possibility. Yet, medieval women were not simply passive recipients of their fate. They displayed immense resilience, practical ingenuity, and quiet strength. Through their roles as mothers, healers, managers, and economic contributors, they shaped their families and communities, influencing their world in ways that often went unrecorded but were profoundly significant. Her voice might not for a child born into the Lord's court or on the battlefield, but within her sphere, her influence was undeniable and essential. For a child born into the medieval world, the concept of childhood as a distinct, prolonged period of innocence and play was markedly different from modern understandings. Life was often short, harsh, and utilitarian, and a child was typically seen as a miniature adult, destined to contribute to the family's survival from a very early age. Yet, despite the practical demands, moments of warmth, instruction, and rudimentary play still existed within their formative years. For an infant, survival was the first, most precarious hurdle. High infant mortality rates meant that many children did not live past their first few years. If a child survived the vulnerabilities of infancy, their early years were spent close to their mother. In peasant homes, the baby might be carried on her back as she worked, or placed in a simple cradle near the hearth. For a noble infant, a wet nurse was often employed, and early care would be overseen by female attendants. Swaddling was common, thought to keep limbs straight and strong. As a child transitioned from infancy, often around the age of 2 or 3, their integration into the family's daily rhythms began. For a peasant child, play was often intertwined with imitation of adult tasks. A boy might mimic his father plowing with a stick, or a girl might pretend to grind flour with stones. By the age of 5 or 6, both boys and girls were expected to contribute meaningfully to household chores. A boy might be sent to scare birds from the crops, gather firewood, or help tend to the animals. A girl would assist her mother with spinning, fetching water, caring for younger siblings, or tending the garden plot. There was no formal schooling. Education was entirely practical, passed down through observation and direct instruction within the family unit. Life lessons were taught by doing, by experiencing the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of the land. For a noble child, particularly a boy, his path diverged significantly around the age of 7. This was a pivotal moment when he would often be sent away from his family home to serve as a page in the household of a powerful lord, or even the king. This fostering was not a sign of neglect, but a deliberate practice designed to instill loyalty to his future liege, teach him courtly manners, and provide him with an education his own parents might not be equipped to give. As a page, his duties were light, running messages, serving at table, learning the hierarchy of the household, and absorbing the social graces of the court. He would also begin his martial training, learning to ride, handling small blunted weapons, and practicing basic archery. His education included
learning Latin and French, history, music, and perhaps reading and writing, often taught by a chaplain or tutor. Around the age of 14, the noble boy's training intensified as he became a squire. His duties became more direct and demanding, focusing almost entirely on military preparation. He would care for his knight's armor and warhorse, learn the art of jousting with blunted lances, and hone his skills with sword and shield. He accompanied his knight to tournaments and, crucially, to battle, where he would witness the grim realities of warfare firsthand. His education at this stage was heavily practical, emphasizing physical prowess, strategy, and the chivalric code, loyalty, courage, honor, and courtesy. For a noble girl, her childhood was largely spent at home, or also fostered in another noble household, often a convent, to learn from an experienced lady. Her education focused on skills necessary to manage a large household: needlework, spinning, weaving, accounting, and perhaps basic medical knowledge. She would learn about social graces, etiquette, and the management of servants. Literacy was not guaranteed, but many noblewomen were taught to read and sometimes write, particularly if they were destined for a convent or a role requiring administrative duties. Her path was usually towards marriage, and her education prepared her to become the mistress of a castle or manor, a crucial economic and social hub. In the towns, childhood also had its distinct trajectory. A craftsman's son would begin his apprenticeship around the age of 12 to 14, binding himself to a master craftsman for many years, often living in the master's home. He would learn the trade hands-on, starting with the most basic tasks and gradually acquiring the skills of his craft. A merchant's son would similarly learn the intricacies of trade, accounting, and business from his father or another merchant. For town girls, their roles often mirrored their mothers, assisting in the shop, learning domestic skills, or engaging in small-scale trade, like brewing or weaving. Some town children, if their parents could afford it, might attend rudimentary grammar schools run by the church or a guild, learning Latin, arithmetic, and basic literacy, a rare opportunity for those outside the nobility or clergy. In the towns, childhood also had its distinct trajectory. A craftsman's son would begin his apprenticeship around the age of 12 to 14, binding himself to a master craftsman for many years, often living in the master's home. He would learn the trade hands-on, starting with the most basic tasks and gradually acquiring the skills of his craft. A merchant's son would similarly learn the intricacies of trade, accounting, and business from his father or another merchant. For town girls, their roles often mirrored their mothers, assisting in the shop, learning domestic skills, or engaging in small-scale trade, like brewing or weaving. Some town children, if their parents could afford it, might attend rudimentary grammar schools run by the church or a guild, learning Latin, arithmetic, and basic literacy, a rare opportunity for those outside the nobility or clergy. Her path was usually towards marriage, and her education prepared her to become the mistress of a castle or manor, a crucial economic and social hub.
By their late teens, medieval children were considered adults, ready to take on the full responsibilities of marriage, work, or military service. Their childhood, though perhaps brief by modern standards, was a period of intensive practical learning, shaping them into the men and women who would perpetuate the rhythms and traditions of their age. The medieval diet, for most, was a stark reflection of social status and seasonal availability, a continuous dance with the land's bounty and scarcity. Food was not merely sustenance, it was a cornerstone of social interaction, a marker of wealth, and deeply intertwined with religious observance. For the peasant, his daily fare was dictated by what could be grown in his fields and gathered from the common lands. The absolute staple was grain, primarily barley, oats, or rye, often supplemented by wheat if he was slightly more prosperous. This grain was most commonly consumed as pottage, a thick, savory gruel cooked slowly over the hearth containing whatever vegetables were available from his garden: cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, or beans. Bread, usually a coarse, dark loaf baked in the communal village oven, for which a fee was paid to the Lord, was a crucial accompaniment, often serving as a trencher, an edible plate. Meat was a rarity, often reserved for Sundays, feast days, or after a successful hunt on common land, though hunting rights were often restricted. He might keep a few chickens for eggs and occasional meat, or a pig that would be slaughtered in autumn, its meat salted or smoked for winter. Fish, if he lived near a river or coast, provided an alternative protein, especially on the many fast days dictated by the church. Water was the most common drink, but often of questionable purity. Therefore, ale was the drink of choice for nearly everyone, from morning to night. It was low in alcohol, brewed daily, and safer to drink than water due to the boiling process. Each household, particularly for peasants, would brew its own. Wine, a luxury, was largely reserved for the nobility and clergy, or for wealthier townspeople, and primarily imported from warmer climes. In the noble household, the diet was vastly different, showcasing wealth and power. Their meals were abundant and varied, often featuring multiple courses. Meat dominated the table. Roasted venison, wild boar, swan, peacock, geese, and various fowl were common. These animals were either hunted in the Lord's private forests or raised on his estates. Fish, both freshwater and saltwater, was also a staple, especially on fast days. Breads were made from fine wheat flour, white and refined, a clear symbol of status. Vegetables, while present, were often relegated to side dishes. Spices imported from the East, such as pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves, were highly prized and used liberally, not just for flavor, but as a display of immense wealth. The preparation of noble food was elaborate. The cook presided over a busy kitchen, often a separate building to mitigate fire risk, with large open hearths and specialized ovens. Food was roasted on spits, boiled in cauldrons, and often spiced and colored to create visually stunning dishes. Feasts, especially, were theatrical events, with grand presentations of food often molded into fantastical shapes or gilded with gold leaf. Feast days were paramount across all social strata, breaking the monotony of daily life. The Christian calendar dictated numerous holidays, providing a rhythm of work, worship, and celebration. Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost were major celebrations, accompanied by special religious services and more elaborate meals. For peasants, a feast day might mean a rare taste of meat, perhaps some better ale, and communal dancing or storytelling in the village green. These were precious moments of respite and community bonding. For the nobility, feast days were opportunities for elaborate banquets in the Great Hall. These were grand affairs, often with numerous guests, including vassals, visiting dignitaries, and traveling entertainers. The high table on a dais was reserved for the lord and lady and their most esteemed guests. Eating etiquette, though different from modern times, was present. Fingers were the primary utensils, but communal salt cellars, trenchers, and shared cups were common. Minstrels, jesters, and acrobats would entertain the assembled company, reinforcing the Lord's generosity and power. Fasting days were as significant as feast days. The church mandated abstinence from meat on Fridays, during Lent, and on numerous other holy days throughout the year. For peasants, this meant a return to pottage and perhaps some dried fish. For nobles, it challenged their cooks to create elaborate meat-free dishes from fish, eggs, and dairy, often still prepared with expensive spices to maintain their accustomed luxury. Preservation techniques were vital in a world without refrigeration. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were common methods for preserving meat, fish, and some vegetables for the leaner months. Grain was stored in granaries, cheese was aged, and fruit was dried or made into preserves. Brewing of ale and wine served not just as a drink, but as a way to preserve perishable grains and fruits. The communal spirit around food was strong. The village oven was shared, and often a communal mill ground the grain. Hunting on common land, though restricted, was shared endeavor. Even noble feasts, while hierarchical, fostered a sense of community among the Lord's household and his retainers. Food, in its preparation, sharing, and consumption, was a constant, tangible reminder of their place in the world, their reliance on the land, and the rhythms of both nature and the church. In the medieval world, the human body was a mystery. Its inner workings understood through a blend of ancient Greek theories, religious belief, and practical observation. For a medieval person, illness was a constant companion, a looming threat that could strike swiftly and without warning, often with devastating consequences. His health, for all his strength and resilience, was always precarious. The prevailing medical theory was the humoral theory, inherited from classical antiquity. It posited that the body was composed of 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor was associated with specific qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, and linked to particular organs and temperaments. Illness was believed to be caused by an imbalance in these humors. Too much blood, for instance, might lead to a fever, while an excess of black bile could cause melancholy. Treatment, therefore, aimed to restore balance, often through practices like bloodletting, cutting a vein to release blood, or purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea. A barber surgeon with his sharp instruments might perform such procedures in his shop, a stark contrast to a modern medical setting. For the common person, access to formal medical care was limited. If he fell ill, his first recourse would likely be to his wife or mother, who possessed a valuable, albeit rudimentary, knowledge of herbal remedies. They would collect plants from fields and forests, brewing teas, concocting poultices, or applying compresses. These remedies, passed down through generations, offered some relief for common ailments like fevers, coughs, or digestive upsets. Prayer was also a vital component of healing. One might pray to saints, visit shrines, or seek the blessings of a priest. Illness was often seen as a divine punishment or a test of faith. More serious injuries, such as broken bones from a fall or wounds from a quarrel, might require the attention of a barber surgeon. These practitioners, often working out of small, simple shops, were skilled in basic surgery, setting bones, lancing boils, and stitching wounds. Their methods were rough by modern standards, with little understanding of hygiene, but they represented the frontier of practical medical intervention. Pain relief was minimal, often involving strong wines or herbal concoctions.
The apothecary, the medieval equivalent of a pharmacist, mixed and sold various herbal concoctions, spices, and even some imported exotic ingredients believed to have medicinal properties. One might consult him for a specific ailment, trusting in his knowledge of plants and their effects. For those with means, like the noble or wealthy townsperson, a more learned physician might be consulted. These individuals, often educated at universities, based their practices on classical texts and humoral theory. They might diagnose by examining urine, observing the patient's temperament, or consulting astrological charts. Their treatments, however, often mirrored those of the barber surgeon and herbalist, emphasizing diet, purgatives, and bloodletting, sometimes with elaborate and expensive concoctions. Childbirth, as noted previously, was a major source of mortality for women. Without antiseptic practices, infection was common, and complications during delivery often led to death for mother or child. Midwives, experienced women from the community, assisted with births, relying on their practical knowledge and traditional methods. Beyond common ailments, the medieval world lived in constant fear of epidemics. The most infamous was the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which decimated populations across Europe. But waves of plague and other diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and influenza were recurring scourges. When a plague struck, it swept through towns and villages indiscriminately, claiming rich and poor alike. The medieval person had no understanding of contagion, and responses often ranged from isolating the sick, burning infected homes, or fleeing to the countryside, to desperate religious processions and flagellation, seeking divine mercy. Sanitation was rudimentary at best. In towns, refuse was often thrown into the streets or open cesspits, attracting rats and flies that spread disease. Water sources were frequently contaminated. Even castles, despite their grandeur, often had poor waste disposal systems. Personal hygiene was limited. Bathing was less frequent than in Roman times, though some people did bathe in rivers or rudimentary bathhouses. Despite the pervasive presence of illness and death, the medieval person showed remarkable resilience. Life was lived with the knowledge that sickness was an ever-present part of existence. Communities often rallied to support the afflicted, and religious faith provided solace and hope in the face of suffering. Healing was a collective effort relying on family care, local wisdom, and the unwavering belief in divine intervention. Beyond the relentless demands of survival and faith, the medieval world, for all its hardships, pulsed with a vibrant cultural life. Art, music, and various forms of entertainment were not mere distractions. They were integral to community, worship, and the expression of human experience. shaping the very soul of the age. For many, religious art was the most prevalent and powerful form of artistic expression. The grand cathedrals and churches that rose majestically above towns and villages were themselves colossal works of art. Their stained glass windows, glowing with kaleidoscopic light, depicted biblical stories and the lives of saints, serving as a visual sermon for a largely illiterate populace. Elaborate stone carvings adorned portals and capitals, telling tales of salvation and damnation. Inside, frescoes and panel paintings brought sacred narratives to life, while intricate gold and silver work adorned chalices, crosses, and reliquaries. These artistic endeavors were monumental acts of devotion, paid for by wealthy patrons, lords, bishops, and guilds, and created by skilled anonymous craftsmen who dedicated their lives to glorifying God. Music was similarly dominated by the church. The plainsong chants, or Gregorian chant, resonated through monastic cloisters and cathedrals, their ethereal melodies providing the soundtrack to daily worship. Polyphony, the art of combining multiple independent melodic lines, gradually developed, adding complexity and richness to sacred music. Beyond the church walls, however, a more secular music thrived. Troubadours and trouvères in France, and later minstrels across Europe, traveled from castle to castle, entertaining lords and ladies with songs of courtly love, heroic deeds, and satirical tales. Their instruments were simple: lutes, harps, flutes, drums, and fiddles, but their performances brought news, gossip, and emotional resonance to isolated noble households. In the villages, simpler folk songs accompanied communal dances, celebrating harvests, marriages, and seasonal festivities. Storytelling was a primary form of entertainment, especially during long winter evenings by the fire. Bards and traveling storytellers would recount ancient legends, chivalric romances, and humorous anecdotes. The tales of King Arthur, Charlemagne, and local saints were passed down through generations, shaping moral values, collective identity. Even in humble peasant cottages, a parent or elder would share fables and cautionary tales with the children. For the common person, games and physical activities provided simple enjoyment. Dice and board games like chess, checkers, and backgammon were popular pastimes for all classes, though the stakes might be higher for nobles. Wrestling, boxing, and other feats of strength were common at village gatherings. Communal dancing to lively tunes, especially during festivals, brought people together in shared merriment. Children too had their toys: wooden dolls, tops, hoops, and crude balls. And their games, often mimicking adult activities or engaging in simple races and chases. Festivals and feast days were the most anticipated breaks from routine, blending religious observance with exuberant celebration. Christmas, Easter, and local saints' days were marked by special church services, followed by communal feasting, drinking, and games. Harvest festivals were particularly vital for peasants, celebrating the end of the agricultural year with banquets and revelry. These events often featured mystery plays and miracle plays, religious dramas performed by town guilds on temporary stages in public squares, bringing biblical stories to life for the masses. For the nobility, tournaments and jousting were the pinnacle of secular entertainment. These highly ritualized spectacles were far more than mere sport. They were displays of martial prowess, chivalry, and wealth. Knights, clad in dazzling armor, would compete in jousts, attempting to unhorse their opponents with lances, or engage in melees, mock battles involving groups of knights. These events drew large crowds, featuring feasting, music, and the pageantry of heraldry. While dangerous, they offered opportunities for glory, ransom, and prize money, cementing a knight's reputation. Even the architecture of the age served an aesthetic purpose. The intricate stonework of a cathedral, the detailed carvings on a church door, or the elegant lines of a noble's hall were not merely functional. They were designed to inspire awe, convey power, and reflect the beauty of divine creation or earthly authority. Through these diverse forms of art, music, and entertainment, the medieval person found solace, celebrated life, expressed their faith, and connected with their community. These cultural expressions, whether grand or humble, provided color and meaning to an age often perceived as solely grim, revealing the enduring human need for beauty, shared experience, and joyful expression.